The king's polished sword lay gleaming, ready for battle in distant lands. Ravens croaked hungrily, and wolves howled from the hills beyond. The forest folk caught sight of a man they dreaded. King Olaf, once exiled, had returned from the land of the Rus to reclaim the throne of Norway. Beside him stood his half-brother, the formidable Harold, just 16 years old. As they marched, vagabonds joined their growing force, which finally gathered on a small hill at Stiklestad. There, they heard the thunder of an opposing army, led by Kulf Arneson, a former ally of Olaf, now serving King Canute the Great, ruler of Denmark, England, and Norway. The air filled with war cries to Christ and Odin as the two armies clashed with ferocity. Olaf's forces were overwhelmed. The hill was slick with blood, scattered with severed limbs and lifeless bodies. Young Harold fell to an enemy's blade, and King Olaf was pierced by a spear. According to the Norse sagas, Olaf collapsed upon a stone, clutching the weapon embedded in his abdomen as he called out to God. He looked up one final time to see Kulf Arneson, who mercilessly ended his life by cutting his throat. As the soldiers scattered, Kulf and his men roamed the blood-soaked hills, mercilessly dispatching the wounded. Amidst the chaos, the bleeding Harold managed to rise and slip away into the wilderness. Staggering through dense forests, he eventually came upon a humble hovel, where a compassionate peasant family took him in and cared for his wounds by the warmth of their fire. For several days, Harold rested and recovered, but he could not linger long. The harsh black winter loomed, threatening to seal the high passes to the east. Wrapping himself in a crimson cloak provided by his hosts, Harold set off once more. Guided by the peasant's son, he entered the mountains, avoiding main roads and the danger of bandits. The prince's journey led him through remote and ancient forests, rumored to be the dwelling place of giants and trolls. Navigating these treacherous lands, Harold eventually reached Sweden, where he found other survivors from Stiklestad. There, he spent the winter gathering strength, forging alliances, and preparing for the next chapter of his journey beyond Scandinavia. Harold and his warriors passed in dragon ships before quiet wooden towns and humble cathedrals. Their forebears had once come to this land of the Rus to slaughter and plunder, for the age of the Viking had begun 2 centuries before. Norse chiefs had gathered the bravest sons of Odin to burn, loot, and enslave all the coasts of Iran. But here the Norse had also settled, and along with local Slavs and Finnic peoples, they established a vast state called the Kievan Rus. In Scandinavia too, the days of the old gods and petty clans were waning. Men like Olaf and Canute had made Christian kings of themselves and brought war against those fractious heathen chieftains. And yet Odin's raven flew still on the royal banners, and the cruel axes of Norsemen were feared in every realm. Thus, Harold and his men endeavored here to become mercenaries. Passing through the lofty gates of Novgorod or Kiev, Harold came to the court of the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, to whom he relayed sorrowful word of Olaf's demise. For it was Yaroslav who had provided sanctuary for Olaf in his exile, and still present in this court were Olaf's mistress and his illegitimate son, Magnus. Yaroslav welcomed Harold and sent the prince and his warriors first into the boglands of Poland, where they slew enemy Poles and destroyed their dwellings. In this manner, Harold sharpened his axe against the prince's enemies for years, earning glory and blood money as he went. He finally proposed that Yaroslav betroth him to his child daughter, the Kievan princess Elizaveta, but Yaroslav refused. At just 18 years old, Harold remained a fearless yet crownless leader among the remnants of King Olaf's loyalists. He had neither land to rule nor wealth to command. In 1034, 2 Norwegians, Einar Thumberskjolfr, large and boisterous, and Kulf Arneson, now infamous, arrived in Kievan. They came not to pledge allegiance, but to secure a new king for Norway, as Canute's rule there began to falter. Their choice was not Harold, whose resolve was unshakable, but young and impressionable Magnus. Lacking the resources and men to contest them or seize the throne he craved, Harold turned his sights to distant lands, where wealth and glory awaited the bold. Gathering a few hundred loyal followers, Harold sailed south to seek his fortune. The journey ended in Constantinople, a city where the legacy of Rome still burned brightly despite the fall of the Western Empire centuries before. The sun gleamed against towering crosses and the golden domes of churches, casting long shadows over aqueducts and crowded streets. This city, the heart of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, was a place of splendor and contrast. Grand forums bustled with merchants from across the known world, while narrow alleys housed the destitute and echoed with the groans of beggars and brothels. Amid this vibrant chaos, Harold approached the imperial palace and pledged himself to the Varangian Guard. These Norse mercenaries were famed for their loyalty and unmatched skill in battle, serving as the personal protectors of Byzantine emperors. Within their ranks, Harold joined the elite warriors who guarded the throne of Emperor Michael IV, seated alongside the enchanting Empress Zoe, a woman of great beauty and intrigue, more than 3 decades a senior. Only months earlier, Michael IV had been a mere commoner, known only as the lover of the Empress Zoe. Whispers across the empire claimed the two had conspired to murder her husband, Emperor Romanus III, and seize power by marrying on the very day of his suspicious death. Despite this scandalous ascension, Harold and his men found themselves welcomed into Constantinople. The empire faced dire threats, and their valor and ferocity were desperately needed. The Islamic Fatimid Caliphate controlled the Holy Land and much of the southern Mediterranean, and in recent times, Muslim corsairs from Sicily and Tunisia had launched relentless raids on the coasts of Christendom. Villages were plundered, men slaughtered, and women and children taken as slaves. In response, Emperor Michael IV dispatched his fleet to combat the invaders. Byzantine ships, armed with the fearsome Greek fire, pursued the corsairs, unleashing torrents of flame that turned the sea into an inferno. Many pirates perished in the fiery onslaught, while others met a grimmer fate at the hands of Harold and his Viking warriors, who boarded their vessels wielding mighty two-handed axes. These encounters ended in utter devastation for the pirates, as Harold's men captured ship after ship. Their campaign extended beyond the sea. Joining the Byzantine land forces, Harold and his men waged brutal assaults on Fatimid-held towns along the empire's borders. The response from the Fatimids was swift and fierce. Christian towns were sacked, their inhabitants killed or enslaved. Yet, amidst the bloodshed, a fragile peace was brokered between the two powers. As part of the agreement, Christians were granted permission to rebuild the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a sacred site destroyed decades earlier by a Fatimid caliph during a period of forced conversions. Harold was among those chosen for the imperial delegation that undertook the arduous journey across the desert to the Holy Land. They traveled the sun-scorched sands until at last they reached Jerusalem. There, amid the sacred shrines, Harold walked the pilgrim's path along the route of the crucifixion, his journey steeped in both faith and destiny. Harold made use of his axe butchering bandits who stalked their caravan, and later stopped to bathe in the River Jordan. Now in his 20s, Harold came to command the Varangians with stern ferocity. He joined the Byzantine invasion of Islamic Sicily and was said to have ended a siege by tunneling under the walls of a city with his Varangians and slaying the garrison. In all his conquests, he plundered greedily and amassed a hoard of foreign treasure. But all was not well in this empire. Prayers rang out in the gilded churches of Constantinople. Dark days lay ahead. All could see the emperor was ailing. His flesh swelled, and he was beset by violent seizures. He adopted his nephew Michael as his son and named him as his successor. Some were wary of the younger Michael, one monk recalled. He concealed a wicked nature under a benign front. He was adept at scheming and plotting. Yet the emperor still lived, and he summoned Harold to claim some final glory at his side and crush a revolt among the Bulgars. And so together they laid waste to the rebel towns, capturing a rebel king who had had his eyes plucked and nose cut off, and they returned to Constantinople in a victorious procession. Harold was hailed as the brave burner of the Bulgars, while the pallid, sickly emperor wavered on his horse. He died soon after, This adopted son was crowned Emperor Michael V, and the Golden Court became a corrupt garden of sycophants, possessed by the paranoia of the emperor. Michael sent men to attack Harold, but he and the Varangians killed the imperial assassins. Neither did Michael V trust Zoe. In truth, he had once thought to make a bride of his adoptive mother, but she was now over 60 and could bear him no heir. He had Zoe arrested, hastily convicted of attempting to poison him, and it was written he dared to cut the hair off Zoe as though she was a common whore, and to banish her to an island in chains, where she was forced to become a nun. The people were outraged. Mobs formed at the feet of pillared palaces. Michael V brooded in his quarters, tormented by their shouts of derision, their love of Zoe. He arranged for the return of the former empress, and forced the captive Zoe to implore the crowds to accept him as their emperor. The people were not swayed by this gesture. Crowds stormed the palace, and Harold and his men joined the rebellion. They cut down the palace guards, overran the royal quarters, and the mobs looted the gold, fine tapestries, and silk therein. Emperor Michael was found cowering in a monastery, pleading that he had relinquished the throne and taken monastic vows. The people dragged him from the altar to the walls of Constantinople. In there, the Norse sagas recorded, it was Harold of Norway himself who emerged to sate the mob's cries for blood. He pulled up the writhing and hysterical Michael V, and with his dagger, he plucked out his eyes. The emperor wailed and bled at the feet of this Viking, and Michael was then said to have been castrated. Then he was banished to a monastery where he died a few months later. In time, the throne would be restored to Zoe. Some believed the empress longed for Harold, and yet Zoe would marry another lover, a man over 20 years her junior. If Harold had washed his blade in the blood of royals, there were yet other kings to slay. For the throne of Norway was sat upon by the bastard son of his dead brother, and counseled by traitors to his house. Harold would have his vengeance. Around the year 1044, as a Yuletide frost crept over the north, King Magnus of Norway brought fire and death to Denmark. Thralls abandoned the burning halls of their fallen masters. Men fell by sword and flame before the eyes of their families, their wives and children seized as spoils of war. The invaders scoured the land for the rebel Jarl Sven, whom the Danes had crowned as their sovereign in defiance of King Magnus. With the passing of Canute the Great, and later his son, King Magnus had claimed the thrones of England and Denmark. Though he did not press his claim to England, his dominion over Denmark was solidified in blood and fire. Sven's forces lay shattered, his warriors slain, their bodies scattered across the land, some drifting lifeless in icy waters, others hiding in the shadows of dense forests. Sven himself fled to safety at the court of the Swedish king, while Magnus the Good was celebrated as the rightful and holy ruler of Norway and Denmark. Whispers of miracles surrounded Magnus' father, the devout King Olaf, now venerated as Saint Olaf by a fervent Christian following. Magnus' armies, bolstered by his divine claim, seemed invincible, and none dared challenge his rule. Yet across the seas, as a storm raged and waves crashed against an unknown vessel, a shadow of the past approached. A Viking long exiled from Norway, uncle to Magnus and brother to Saint Olaf, had returned. This was Harold Sigurdsson, the renowned mercenary. Sailing toward his homeland, Harold carried with him not only his ambition, but also a fortune, strange and countless treasures amassed in distant lands. Seeking refuge at the Swedish court, he bided his time, his eyes fixed on the throne of Norway. For roughly 15 years had passed since he fled Scandinavia from that battlefield where his brother Olaf fell, and he had since won glory and riches in the land of the Rus in the Byzantine Empire as the hired champion of princes and emperors. That autumn, when Magnus and his men were along the coasts, they were struck by the approach of Harold's magnificent ship. King Magnus received his uncle with guarded cordiality. The Grand Prince of Kiev had recently betrothed his fair daughter Elisaveta to Harold, and so it was seen that Harold possessed riches greater than King Magnus himself, a wife of status and a blood claim to the throne. Harold asked Magnus how he wished to divide the rule of Norway between them. Magnus answered that he was obliged to consult with his advisors on the matter. His chief advisor then stepped forward. This old enemy of Olaf, Einar Thumberskjálfr, chastised Harold. We are not keen to be divided between two kings. We have always served one king, and so it must remain for as long as King Magnus continues to reign. Harold returned in shame to Sweden. If his enemies would not see him as king, they would suffer him as a warrior. The dragon ships cast onto the shore, and Northmen swept over the land at the command of Sven and Harold. The two men had sworn an oath of allegiance. Together, they would seize Denmark for Sven and Norway for Harold. Towns were engulfed in flames, their cries echoing through the night. Men were butchered without mercy, and women were dragged screaming from their homes. Few survived to recount the horror, for the sorrow-stricken fell as if the land itself mourned their fate. The only captives taken were young maidens, led in chains to the shore. Fair-haired and trembling, they were driven onto ships, their tender skins scarred by iron shackles. When tidings of these atrocities reached Magnus, his council advised caution. They deemed it unwise to oppose Harold directly. Secret negotiations began between Magnus and Harold, eventually leading to a fragile agreement for co-rulership of Norway. Sven, sensing betrayal, plotted against Harold and made an attempt on his life while he slept. Harold narrowly escaped, and after months of turmoil, he was finally crowned King Harold III of Norway. As co-rulers, tensions ran high. Magnus, beloved by his people for his kindness and generosity, insisted on being the primary king, holding precedence in court and ceremony. Harold, however, viewed these traits as weakness and childishness, fueling his resentment. The two kings clashed in words, hurling insults freely, yet a common threat bound them together: the need to confront Sven in Denmark. In the autumn of 1047, while campaigning against Sven, Magnus fell gravely ill. As his strength waned, he declared that Harold would inherit sole rule of Norway, while Denmark was to be given to Sven. Soon after, Magnus the Good passed away. Harold, however, had no intention of honoring the dying king's wishes. Wasting no time, he began preparing to march on Denmark, determined to seize its throne for himself. But in the king's assembly, Einar openly declared that he himself would return to bury Magnus in Norway, and that he would rather serve Magnus dead than any other king alive. The fighting men loyal to the chieftain Einar were so numerous and his influence so great that Harold had little choice but to tolerate such treasonous speech and return to assert his rule over Norway. For the high thrones of Scandinavia had not entirely supplanted the power of the Viking halls. Kings were still obliged to reckon with the old war clans of every region. Sven was raised as the king of the Danes, and when Harold went to ravage Denmark in the summer, Sven eluded capture. Harold returned to Norway and married a second wife, Thora of the influential Arnesen family. While his wives would bear him children to be raised as heirs to Norway, the king's gaze turned ever south. In 1050, he returned to terrorize Denmark. His Vikings tore over farmland, ruined villages, and burned churches. They tortured people to death, violated women, and burned the trading post of Hedeby. When Spain at last met Harold with a massive army, Harold fled. In Norway, Harold moved to punish and assassinate those who questioned his rule. Yet Einar stood at the head of a mighty faction of chieftains who freely decried the king's butchery. At length, Harold requested a meeting with Einar to resolve the matter. Einar stepped alone into the king's chamber and remarked how dark the room was. A few of Harold's men then emerged from the shadows and killed him. Einar's son rushed in to the aid of his father, and they killed him too. The people came to despise King Harold, and there was wide talk of rebellion among the farmers. The king tasked his ally, Finn Arnesen, to entreat them to peace. Finn requested the king offer something in exchange for so dangerous a quest: the safe return of his brother, Kulf. Kulf Arnesen was the greatest traitor to Harold's house. He was said to have personally killed Olaf. When Magnus learned of this crime years ago, Kulf fled into exile to the Norwegian domains along the northern edge of Scotland. Harald now welcomed Culf back to Norway and restored him to his old estates. Then, in the summer, King Harald went on campaign in Denmark and demanded that Culf make the first assault against the Danish position. Only after Culf was overrun and killed with his men did Harald land with reinforcements. Finn and all the people saw plainly the treachery of their vengeful king.